People who work in morgues or with the dead, what is the creepiest thing you've witnessed? Sometimes when people have died and we turn them over to clean and dress them, they still have air in their lungs and will make grunting noises when moved. Scared the crap out of me the first time I experienced it. We now have a Discord. Check out the server in the link in the description. Story 2. My grandpa had a related experience in Vietnam. He was helping wash and prepare bodies for transport home under the direction of the coroner, who had warned them about the bodies making noises when moved. After a bit, Grandpa asked the coroner how the body he was washing could cry. The coroner repeated the lecture about air being pushed out, and Grandpa said that he got that part, but how did that form tears? He said things got very busy after that. Grandpa's assigned corpse was not dead, just suffering a lot of blood loss and very, very cold. Dude got 5 liters of blood, some of it for my grandpa, and then he flew home to spend the rest of the war recovering. Personally, that is my biggest fear, being thought to be dead when I'm still alive. I'm glad they caught this one in time. Story 3. I worked at a funeral home for quite a while. When I first started, about a month in, I was working a holiday weekend. Only people working were the transport guys and me. They came to drop off a body and went right back out. I thought they were still there and needed to ask a question. I walked into the embalming area and this dude was sitting up on the gurney looking right at me when I opened the door. And it literally made me pee a little in fright. Turns out the transport guys picked up the body from an area hospital. He'd passed away while in a slightly reclining position and rigor had set in. They couldn't flatten him out. Still the scariest moment in my career, even if I did get a laugh out of it later. Story 4. I initiated compressions on my patient when she unexpectedly coded. About halfway through my first round, the patient pinked up, eyes opened, turned her head, and groaned. I stopped and so did she. Turned gray and unresponsive, so I started compressions again. She woke up again, and I realized that compressions were providing adequate perfusion to her brain, so she'd wake up, but her heart wasn't doing anything. I had to continue compressions and shock my patient who was awake, groaning, and alert enough to know what was happening. I've coded countless patients without a problem, but this event gave me nightmares for some time. Story 5. I was part of search and rescue for 3 years. I was in the scuba team, so we were responsible for finding the usually dead people at sea. The salt water adds so much horror to a body, not to mention the fish that will usually start picking on a corpse sooner rather than later. My creepiest experience was trying to find the body of a Jane Doe who was missing. She was a prostitute against her will, brought over by human trafficking. Turns out she slit her wrists parallel to her veins and jumped into this rocky and sharp outcrop into the sea. We went diving in less than ideal conditions. It was low visibility and waves. My scuba buddy and I were looking at an outcrop, when suddenly out of the darkest deep, a blue hand emerged from this little cavern in the rocks. It began twitching and moving, and as we tried to pull the hand, the rest of the corpse emerged. She was being picked on by eels, hence the twitching, which emerged with bits of human flesh in their mouth. Her mouth was wide open in a scream position and her eyes were gone. You can see tendons and bones in her hands, and the sharp rocks tore her entire body to shreds in various spots. Her toes were mostly gone too, with some bits of bone sticking out. To this day, it haunts me. The worst was pulling her out and swimming with the body as eels and fish followed us, occasionally picking on bits of flesh. Actually, I'd like to revise my earlier statement. That wasn't my biggest fear. That was my second biggest fear. Dying in water is my biggest fear, particularly drowning. It sounds awful, and I've heard other reports that it is. On the other hand, feeding the underwater ecosystem? Not that bad. Story 6. Human osteologist here. I work with dry human bones, so they don't do much. But one of the times I've ever gotten the creeps was when I was handling a crania in the collection and could hear the wisdom teeth shaking around. Partially formed, but not quite erupted, in the mandible. Wisdom teeth form around 18 years old and erupt generally in late teens or early 20s. I at the time was about 20 and my wisdom teeth were just coming through. I realized these remains belonged to a girl about my age, and that's probably exactly what my skull looked like. It really humanized things for me. Story 7. Here's a funny story from my grandma. She used to work in an ER in Puerto Rico. Some guy had passed away, and so the doctor came up to her and asked her to prepare the body to go to the morgue. So she got some sheets and started to wrap this guy up. As she crossed his legs, suddenly his dong became fully erect and was straight up. She wasn't sure what to make of it, but it forced her to have to redo the sheets. So as she uncrossed his legs, the dong went down. So she was like, all right, let's get this over with. Then she crossed them back up again, and lo and behold, the dong went straight back up. Tried one more time, and then she got freaked out and went back to the doctor. Obviously, he found this hilarious as the guy apparently had a prosthetic in his dong. Story 8. Worked at a mortuary for a few years. We have methods to keep the jaw shut for viewing, otherwise it would gape open due to the angle of the head and neck. During a viewing, the device failed and this gentleman's mouth literally popped open. The lead embalmer was not on site, so I did my best. I ushered the family out of the room and superglued his mouth shut, but he didn't have teeth and supergluing just his lips did not work. It looked as if he was attempting to scream. I had to call in one of our other mortuaries in town, and that embalmer used a giant needle and thread to sew his mouth shut from under his chin to his palate. Story 9. Not necessarily the creepiest thing, but the funeral home I worked for liked to embalm as soon as possible after death. I had embalmed a man that was dead for less than 30 minutes to an hour. He was still warm and rigor hadn't set in yet. I kinda just held his hand for a minute before I got started. There is something so much worse about handling a body in those sorts of situations that is like fresh as opposed to been dead for a while. At least in my mind, I guess. I've never had experience, I promise. Story 10. My wife is a mortician. She's had quite a lot of wacky experiences. This one is more funny than creepy, but once she was trying to break up the rigor mortis in a descendant's hip by flexing the entire leg up. Her grip slipped and the leg swung down, the heel cracking right in the face, resulting in a black eye. She had to explain to people that no, she's not in an abusive relationship, she just got kicked in the face by a dead guy. Story 11. A friend told me this story years ago, and I hope I remember it well enough. When he was 18, he worked for a single-plane transport contractor, and one time they had to carry a body. It wasn't autopsied or prepared for funeral yet, that was where they were taking it. So it was wrapped and just sort of laying on the floor. Now, when you're in the air, I'm sure other pilots will tell you, the rise and fall of the airplane will do strange things with gravity, air pressure, and necromancy. In any case, the corpse had enough air in its lungs that the lower pressure outside the body caused the air inside to be expelled slowly and through the larynx. Meanwhile, the rise and fall of the plane caused the body to sit up and the wrapping to fall away. Sitting up caused it to expel more air from the lungs. So while flying a dead body in the plane, they heard a long, low moan and saw a dead body sit up in the back of the plane. The pilot panicked, left the controls, and ran back and punched the corpse across the face, knocking it back down. He told me about how they figured out what was happening, but I was laughing too hard at that point to really pick up the details. I do remember that they had to explain the additional damage to the corpse when they arrived at their destination. Just so everyone knows, that was genuine laughter there. Oh my god, that's so funny. Imagine that guy going around telling everyone, yeah, I had a fight in an airplane once, I punched a guy out. Yeah, he was dead when we landed. Oh, that's so good. Story 12. Had a gig doing overnight transport of dead bodies. Think black suit, white shirt, black tie, unmarked black van, and boss made us wear white gloves. He wanted us to look high-end. Needed to transport a recently deceased middle-aged woman. Breast cancer. 250 miles in the dead of night from a hospital morgue to a mortuary near her extended family. It's been a solid 2 hours of total silence when the corpse lets out a low wail. I about crapped myself as I swerve off the freeway and spray out a rooster tail of gravel and dirt. Even though intellectually I know this is just stomach gases escaping the body, I couldn't help but be a little freaked out. Story 13. Attended a suspected fire once where we could smell smoke but we couldn't locate the fire. Eventually located it, and when we entered the house there was an old woman slumped over on the floor. Tried to turn her over but couldn't. Turned out that she'd been laid on one of the old bar type heaters, and because the heat was not allowed to escape, it had burnt a hole through the floorboards, and the heater fell through the floor. However, when she was laid on it, her body fat started to melt and run into the floorboards, then when the heater fell through, she cooled. By the time we got there, she was one with the floor. 2 of us had to get shovels under her to roll her over. It was years before I could eat smoky bacon flavor crisps again. Story 14. Before COVID, I worked at a funeral home that wasn't particularly well run. I was a funeral assistant, and one of the embalmers was notoriously difficult to deal with. Her name was AJ. About 4 days before this story, AJ had picked up a deceased man who had died of septicemia and who was to be cremated due to the fact that he was already in a bad state on death. So AJ had the brilliant idea to leave this gentleman on the rolling cot for 4 days unrefrigerated, figuring it wouldn't matter since he was being cremated and it was a slow week. Of course, I got the job of moving him to the crematorium with AJ. We walked into the embalming room and found that the decadent had bloated and was leaking a gray liquid sludge out of his urinary catheter onto the floor. If pestilence had a smell, it would have been this liquid. It smelled like a warning to the base lizard part of my brain. To describe it as smelling bad would be an understatement. The liquid was something you could feel and sense in the air. AJ and I donned our gear, and luckily since she placed him in a cot already, we didn't have to do much in the ways of moving the body. Unluckily, the cot was a relatively old one, and one of the cot wheels had to be manually unlocked using hands, as the foot pedal was too rusted to effectively use. AJ told me to unlock it, and so I carefully bent down and unlocked the wheel. Well, AJ got the bright idea to shake the cot violently as some sort of prank, sending the gray liquid over the edge directly on top of my head, dripping down under my eye protection and mask. I closed my lips and eyes so the liquid running over them would stay out of my body, and calmly walked to the employee bathroom in a sort of numb state of shock. The funeral home owners saw my sludgy appearance and sent me home paid for the rest of the day. Two things. First of all, this is absolutely disgusting and definitely seems like a health hazard. I really hope AJ got a talking to. And second, I totally am realizing now that I said descendant when the word was decadent earlier. Whoops. Story 15. I worked as a forensic technical/medical examiner's assistant for roughly 2 years. We were cross-trained in both autopsy and decadent removal from death scenes. I wouldn't particularly say anything was creepy per se, but some things were definitely gross and morbid. Going down to the satellite office, there's one HQ office in the state capital and a few smaller satellite offices throughout the state. In the south, that was in the woods at 3 a.m. in the middle of a storm. That can be categorized as creepy though, for sure. However, I'll do my best to provide a synopsis of some of the creepiest things I've encountered in no particular order. The man who used women's underwear as a toilet/toilet paper. This was a strange one. Two brothers live in a would-be condemned house, both of which are severely intellectually challenged. However, one more than the other. This was one of the most repulsing living situations I have ever personally seen. Black mold everywhere, the ceiling caving in, everything covered in crumbling drywall and water damage. Ironically enough, they had no running water. The only clean thing in the house were 2 pallets of baked beans and Coca-Cola. The only thing these people ate were beans, and they only drank Coke by the pallet. Anyway, we get upstairs into the deceased brother's room to find him lodged between the bed and the wall. Not uncommon for someone who dies suddenly in their bed, in all honesty. However, what we find all over the floors is horrifying. Not only does the bedroom look like a typical hoarder's place with newspapers and rank junk piled up beyond your knees, no. What we see is women's underwear strewn across the floor, each covered in fecal matter. Not only this, there were guns everywhere. Not like nice guns either, like old, decrepit, rusted out guns. The entire house was filled with them, hundreds of unusable guns. The ATF had to come clear the scene and document them all. It was insanity. The autopsy, however, was completely unremarkable. The man whose face was infested with wasps. This one was fairly unremarkable overall, with the exception of the fact that the face had been eaten off by a wild animal overnight. This poor soul was riding his bike through a field of cranberry bogs and suddenly died. By the morning, his face was eaten off by a wild animal. He looked like the Terminator. Some musculature remained, as did one of his eyes, but his lips, cheeks, and soft bits were eaten. Upon my arrival, a small swarm of yellow jackets had kindly taken to the man's face and were eating and laying eggs in it. We had to bug bomb the body bag before opening it to make sure the wasps didn't get into the morgue. Decapitation via high-tension wire. A man jumped from a bridge after tethering a length of high-tension wire to it, and his neck is a noose. The force ripped his head clean off. That was the first and only decapitation I actually saw on the job. Woman ODs 8 months pregnant. Not much to say here other than the autopsy was insane. The medical examiner was able to remove the amniotic sac without breaking it, so we got to see the baby through the paper-thin sac. Extremely sad and heartbreaking, but contextually interesting. This man really came out of the gates swinging with these stories, huh? That first one was by far the wildest. The rest actually seem like pretty interesting. The wasps are just annoying, but the other two, seem interesting. Well, like interesting in a morbid curiosity in the most literal sense of the word, or phrase, kind of way. But the first one is just super gross. I wouldn't want to be anywhere near that house. Story 16. I work as a motor vehicle collision analyst. We get called to fatal vehicle collisions and reconstruct what happened/caused a collision. We also provide analysis and provide courts with expert testimony. I've seen a lot of deceased persons and animals. I've seen almost every wretched way a human can die in a collision. However, there is one that stays with me every fall. In late October, I get called out to a fatal single vehicle accident. The driver was traveling through a shallow S-curve but going too fast. She was not able to negotiate the first turn, and her vehicle enters into critical velocity. The wheels buckle on the passenger side, and she rolls. She was not wearing her seatbelt, and through the first roll was partially ejected out the driver's side window. Her skull was crushed between the outside of the door and the road and continued to flop, partially ejected as the vehicle rolled. The skull was split from her left eye to the right rear behind her ear. This caused her brain matter to be strewn about the road and car. Her body was eventually thrown from the vehicle and came to rest on the side of the road. One aspect of the job requires an inspection of the bodies to look for evidence. I approached the body that is facing upright on her back. The skull was very open, and I could clearly see the inside cavity of the skull with no brain. The brain was deposited in chunks on the road and had a distinct smell. This scene didn't bother me at the time. I was more fascinated than anything else. A few hours later, I get a call from my wife just asking how the day's going. I told her I was on scene and couldn't talk too long. She then asks if I'll be working late tonight or come home on time because tonight we were going to be carving pumpkins with the kids. Years later, I still can't carve pumpkins, and kids have no idea why. I did not see that twist at the end coming. Yeah, that would put me off carving anything gourd-shaped for a while. Pretty good lesson though. Wear a seatbelt. Your chance of surviving is much higher if your brain is not all over the road. You know what helps with that? A seatbelt. Buckle up, kids. Story 17. I used to be a med lab technician in the Army and sometimes assist with autopsies in the hospital. We did one on an infantryman that was a suicide by gunshot to the right temple. The round passed under his frontal lobe and just behind his eyes, so it barely skimmed his brain. The pathologist estimated that it actually took several minutes for him to die just because the location merely made him bleed out and wasn't instant. The creepy thing was, because the round passed just behind his eyes and wasn't hollow point or anything that spread out, it snipped the back of his eyes, causing them to drain. So his eyes were kind of deflated looking, on the top being very glossy as a dead person's eyes are. It was weird and sad. Story 18. I got punched in the balls by a dead guy. I used to work hospital security. Part of our job was to help with assists, movement of bodies to and out of the morgue. I was on call to move one, and the body's limbs were sticking out at odd, stiff angles. I attempted to move the corpse's arms into a better spot to shimmy the bag into the body fridge. His arms stayed in place for a moment, but when I released my grip, smack! Old buddy hit me right in the sack. Story 19. The creepiest thing is the frickin' curtain of flies and maggots blanketing the floor of an apartment where a woman had been decomposing in the hot, late August/early September sun for 3 weeks before she was discovered. I thought it was dark in that apartment, but there were simply just that many flies caught in the glass covering the light bulbs. On the ceiling, the floor lamp, the stovetop light, every single light was simply covered with flies. The windows were dark with flies, dead flies, and even more flies than that on the window panes. It was a horror movie. She was melted into the couch. When we tried to pick her up, her spine just fell outside the rest of her body and she ended up in pieces. I guess it's less creepy and more skin crawling, but I hate flies and maggots. Freshly dead I can deal with. Decomposition in and of itself is fine, but the sight of those flies was just ugh. I'm pretty sure I threw out the clothes I wore that day. I just couldn't. Story 20. Here we go. Back in the day, I used to work for a funeral home, and oftentimes when an elderly client had prearrangements and they pass away, I would be dispatched to collect their earthly remains, and then bring them back to the funeral home to be prepped for their celebration of life/going away party. This is after there is no suspected foul play. Now, sometimes this would be a collection directly from the morgue or from their residence. More often than not, this was typically in the middle of the night, on call 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. Well, one night I was dispatched to collect an elderly gentleman who crossed the Rainbow Bridge and was deemed to be picked up around 1 a.m. By the time I got back and to the residence, it was around 2 a.m. and back to the funeral home around 3. Once I helped Mr. Doe get comfortable in our cooler, I was ready to leave. As I was just getting ready to set the alarm and head back home, the prep room door behind me flung open and then slammed very abruptly. This door is huge and heavy and takes some power to open and close. Needless to say, I was early for my normal shift in the morning because, well, I didn't go back to sleep. The creepiest thing about it is that just before that happened, the hair rose on the back of my neck. Story 21. My creepiest moment was when I was in the morgue by myself at 4 a.m. I was using the lift to put a body in a crypt. It had reached roughly eye level when the power went out. It is now pitch dark. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Then, all the fans died, and all I could hear was the crinkling of body bags. That's when I started to hear disembodied voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying or where they were coming from. The power comes back a few moments later on, and I move on with my night. It turns out the voices were just the automated "the power has gone out, switching to generator power" message.